Hello and welcome to another episode of Never Mind the Dam Busters, the podcast dedicated to all things Bomber Command, with me, Jane Gulliford-Lowes. I'm flying without second pilot and observer James Jeffries this week, but James will be back next week as usual, so I'm afraid you just stuck with me for this episode. I want to begin by thanking listeners for all their comments and reviews, and a special thank you to everyone who signed up to be a paid subscriber. Your support is really helping us to transition to weekly episodes. Soon we'll be adding early access and live streams too, so if you'd like to join us, just click on the link in the show notes. Now this week, I've been really looking forward to this episode. We have an absolute belter for you. Today we're joined by two of my favourite people, Dr. Dan Ellin from the University of Lincoln and the International Bomber Command Centre, who's written extensively on the issue of the RAF's infamous lack of moral fibre policy, and Mary Brazier, a mental health professional who loves a bit of war waffle, to talk about how psychiatric casualties were dealt with by the RAF in general and Bomber Command in particular. Now, Mary's MA thesis was entitled In the Absence of Doctrine, an examination of the role of psychology and psychiatry in RAF Bomber Command. So there's so much to talk about that this could well turn into a two-parter episode, so we'll just see how it goes. Welcome, Dan, and welcome, Mary.
Hi, Jane.
Hello.
Lovely to see you both. Now, we all saw each other just a few weeks ago at the We Have Ways Festival down in Buckinghamshire. Is that the right county? Yeah, at Silverstone. And we had a fantastic weekend, didn't we? Dan, you were there on the Saturday. Mary, you were there a full weekend. And Mary did a fantastic talk about psychiatric casualties and treatment in relation to desert warfare. Do you just want to fill us in a little bit about what that was about, Mary?
Yeah. I went off-piste, bearing in mind that I've been immersed in all things Bomber Command, as you've just said, Jane. My MA thesis was on psychology and psychiatry in Bomber Command, and which was the talk I did at the We Have Ways Fest last year. And when I was putting a proposal forward for this year, I thought, I'll do something different. I'll go completely off-piste and I'll talk about forward psychiatry in the desert, which seemed like a good idea at the time. And it was a rabbit hole that I'd been tempted by when I was delving into the archives for my thesis. And then when I eventually had to write the talk, I couldn't find what I needed. It was one of those things. But yeah, it's fascinating in terms of how we treat psychiatric casualties and how treatment for mental health conditions, understanding of mental health conditions varied across services, varied across theatres, varied across nationalities as well. The UK British Forces treated it differently to the US, which we'll cover with different bomber commands. So yeah, that's what I was talking about a few weeks ago. And I've had to have a bit of a revision on my thesis because I'd kind of put that to one side while I was talking about actual pointy bang bangs in the desert, which is completely off-piste for me.
Well, it was a great talk and I really enjoyed it. It was brilliant.
It was absolutely fantastic, the talk, yeah, despite your pages blowing all around the place.
But luckily, and that happened last year, and I promised myself it wouldn't happen this year, and it did. But luckily, there were the pages I'd used, so that was fine. They could go wherever they wanted.
Hopefully we'll not have any pages blowing around anywhere this evening. Right, so let's get stuck into our conversation then. What I want to do is to begin with a description from historian Professor Richard Overy. Now, he observed that the permanent dangers to which aircrew were exposed and the sheer mental and physical demands of combat, at times surrounded by dead or dying companions with jammed guns or engines knocked out, created a temporary nightmare world in which the one hope was that their aircraft and crew would not be next. Flying Officer Bob Lloyd, a Canadian bomber pilot serving with 408 Squadron, described the mental impact of bombing operations on his crew. My navigator lost his mind during our 26th of November trip to Berlin. My bomb aimer went absolutely wild over the target area on a later raid, to such a degree that we couldn't let him wear an intercom. The navigator had to drop the bombs. They were as frightened as hell. They flew until they couldn't fly anymore. And finally, from Bomber Command pilot Phillip Gray, who wrote, "Even heroes have a breakdown point. Honour and moral fibre are variables. Like pain, the threshold is different in each of us." some quite thought-provoking quotes there, which kind of set the scene about what we're going to be talking about today. That's the one, Ghosts of Target Past. Dan's just showing up the book to the screen there. Yeah. What I'll do is at the end, I'll put a link in the show notes to all the books and all the articles and everything that we discussed today, so that people can delve into this topic in more detail if they want to. So let's begin then. Mary, question to you first of all. A quick explanation of the difference between psychology and psychiatry, and what we actually mean by psychiatric casualties, because I think lots of people get psychology and psychiatry confused, me included. So there you go.
It's actually quite complicated, that question, for the time we're talking about. Now it's not complicated at all. Two completely separate professions, registrations, regulatory bodies. At the time, that wasn't the case. And I think it is worth emphasising that mental health care was still in its formative years, shall we say. So even the profession of psychiatry, so doctors who practice within the field of mental health, many of the station medical officers, for example, who were providing the mental health care for the crews under their aegis, were not necessarily particularly well trained in psychiatry. Some of them may have had an interest in it. Many of them didn't. So they were providing mental health care without that specialism. So there were psychiatrists involved. And certainly there was one of the things I reference quite a lot in my thesis is there was a War Cabinet subcommittee on psychology and psychiatry in the services. They didn't necessarily draw a distinction between the two. It's a bit of an all-encompassing term to describe people in the 30s and 40s who worked with mental illness. Psychology, again, there wasn't necessarily the profession of clinical psychology as we would recognise it today. And the psychologists who were involved in this work were generally what we would, again, think today of as organisational psychologists. So they were thinking more of how do we make people efficient and effective in what they do. So the people involved in that work, the academics involved in that work, and they were largely academics rather than clinicians, were people at Oxford and Cambridge generally who were involved in the work. But they were focusing, for example, on standardised testing. Psychologists really good at standardised testing, still are today. And they were, for example, using tests to determine how fatiguing it was to fly particular aircrafts. And they designed standardised tests to see that. So there were objective and subjective measures. It wasn't only what crews were saying when they got off. It was also submitting them through a battery of tests to see objectively how fatigued, how tired they were when they were flying particular aircraft. So that's a very long-winded way of saying it isn't particularly clear-cut. Basically, doctors who had a particular interest in mental health and people who worked within the field of psychology within academia.
Can I chuck another one into the mix as well, just to drop you in it? So the consultants that the RAF had, there were a mixture of neurologists and psychiatrists, and the RAF called this practice of medicine neuropsychiatry. I think there was a bit of a conflict between the two sides as to who was going to take precedence. So where do the neurologists come in amongst all of that?
Well, it's interesting you say that because, again, one of the key people involved in this is Air Vice Marshal Sir Charles Simmons, who was, and I find it really interesting that he's described in the literature as a neuropsychiatrist, a psychiatrist and a neurologist. Mm-hmm. When I tracked down his papers, which are actually held at the Wellcome Collection, I was expecting to find a whole goldmine of him reflecting on all the work he led on, which was huge. He was, the main person who was pulling all of this work together and the main author on many of the papers that were being published throughout the war and one of the key decision makers for the application of policy. And post-war, he went back to the Head Injury Centre in Oxford and practiced as what we would think today as a neurologist, people who work with those with physical head injuries. It's not the same. We use the terminology is much different. So it's really difficult to pay much attention to the labels that they were given at the time, I think.
Yeah, sorry, Jane. The other person that I don't like Simmons. I think he's a bit harsh. He's not very nice. I think that Gillespie, who was a psychiatrist, was a bit more touchy-feely and cuddly and easier to get
He was
on
an
with.
actual psychiatrist.
Yeah.
He was one of the few, yeah.
So what provision for mental health care and psychiatric casualties existed within the RAF more widely, and with the Bomber Command specifically, at the outbreak of the war, if any? And how did that actually evolve through the course of the war, Mary?
In terms of psychiatric care, I don't know if Dan's better at answering that than I can, but the main treatment was about rest, really, because they weren't generally seeing people as experiencing an illness that needed treatment. They were seeing them as people who were exhausted. So many euphemisms to describe it: flying stress, flying fatigue, a number of different terms. But it was mainly about taking people off operational flying duties and giving them a break. I don't know, Dan, do you have more detail than that?
I mean, it's like it's the same story all over again. The lessons that were learned about this sort of stuff in the First World War were kind of forgotten in the interwar period. And you need to look at Lindsay Shaw Cobden's work if you want to look at the First World War stuff. Going into the war in 1939.
I'm just holding up, because the lessons not learnt from shell shock, and I'm holding up, helpfully for a podcast, the report of the War Office Committee of Inquiry into Shell Shock.
I've got a copy of that somewhere.
And it is particularly disappointing that there was so much consideration given to the phenomena of shell shock, and so much consideration given as to the language that they wanted to use to describe the phenomena. And then it also, in the sort of 20 years in between, it all got kind of forgotten and they were starting again, frustratingly.
Yeah, so the RAF in 39, they thought, the majority of our flyers are officers and gentlemen and cut from the right sort of cloth, and it won't happen to them because, they are made of sterner stuff, and we've trained them correctly, and we've chosen the right people by all the selection procedures and training. So there was a memo that went round in 39 saying under no circumstances should anybody in the services use the term shell shock. And partly following on from the First World War, this was in an endeavour to try and save money on paying out pensions. So they went into the war expecting everyone would be perfectly fine. They're all volunteers. They know what they're getting into. It will be a piece of cake, probably, as James would say. And then, of course, 1940, the first time there was any great amount of action, they found that they were having, sometimes a 50% chop rate. So, the attrition rate was totally unsustainable. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to go, hang on a minute, if I go up 2 or 3 times, that'll be it. That's curtains. And, the idea was that at this point of the war, there were 2 ways to stop flying, because they didn't want you to unvolunteer. You volunteered to fly, but they wouldn't let you stop. Term was coffins or crackers. That was the only 2 ways to get off operational duty. And then, because they've got this, the Air Ministry, the RAF brass realised they've got this issue, and they had a meeting March 1940, and they came up with this term, lack of moral fibre, which we can probably talk about a little bit more.
Yeah, but that distinction between officers and men, I think, is really important. And it just reminds me of a quote I used from the report I've just mentioned, which is that receiving the Committee of Inquiry say that they received the evidence of officers who have suffered from shell shock and of men who have been the victims of one form or another of war neuroses. It says officers get shell shock.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
in the Second World War, officers would get anxiety, whereas other ranks and NCOs would get hysteria, which is obviously slightly more feminine and less masculine, less butch and manly. They also so there's a couple of key characters who are fantastic sources when you're studying this stuff. One is James Lawson, who was the guy in charge of examining everyone that went down the lack of moral fibre route. And the other one was a medical officer who became a psychiatrist after the war, David Stafford Clark. And the Wellcome Library has some correspondence between them. It's different times, folks, but the sort of class-ridden society that they had then, both of them really looked down on the grammar school boys who eventually became the majority of the Bomber Command Air Force, and also the different trades in a bomber aircraft. It was thought that generally, rule of thumb, the pilot and the bomb aimer and the navigator would be officers, and the wireless operators, flight engineers, rear gunners, mid-upper gunners, they would be grammar school boys or even God forbid, tradesmen. And they were thought to be much more likely to have either medical problems or lack of moral fibre problems. And a couple of other things that were sort of pointers towards this. If you were married with kids, you probably wouldn't have that press-on attitude. And the way they thought about it as any kind of breakdown was, it wasn't because of the traumatic events. It was the fault of the person. The person was at fault, and they had this idea of predisposition. So some people will be more predisposed than others to crack up under pressure, and that just followed on with the ideas of class and your upbringing. And if you're public school, of course, you could handle it. And if you were...
Absolutely. And one of the papers that Simmons published, amongst dozens of papers, I think it's 47 or so papers that were published together towards the end of the war, where they were looking at 100 cases of people who had experienced flying stress. And what they're looking for is the predisposition, because the assumption is the fault's in the individual. And if someone hasn't coped, it's because they got through somehow. We didn't pick up the predisposition in the original selection process. So then the psychiatric interviews are focused on finding the predisposition. So it might be that Auntie Nellie, 20 years ago, spent some time in a psychiatric institution. Aha, that's the predisposition. That's why he didn't cope. It's not the experiences of combat flying. It's the fact that there was a predisposition that we missed originally. So the fault was always, as you say, Dan, it was always with the person. It wasn't about their experiences. And it's that there's almost a willful blindness, wasn't there, in terms of, hello, you're not seeing what people are being put through. And there might be something here that you're deliberately avoiding acknowledging.
Yeah, and they look for predisposition, and because they look for it, they found it in a lot of cases. And the neuropsychiatric specialists at the hospitals and the NYDN centres, not yet diagnosed neurotic or neurosis centres, they found 70% of the people that were sent to them had got some sort of predisposition, whereas the medical officers on operational stations were finding around half, around 50%. But some of the things that are on the list to look out for, hello, I've got loads of them. I'm not a great swimmer. I don't like getting water on my face. I've never liked that as a kid.
It's getting your hair wet, Dan.
It is. Yeah, I've been known to pick my nose occasionally, and I'd sometimes bite my nails. Those are signs, folks.
I think it's interesting for me, as Jane said at the beginning. I'm a mental health social worker myself. I'm a practitioner. I'm used to doing mental health assessments, psychiatric assessments, and part of that is you gain a history and a family history. So what's been the individual's experiences from childhood through to adulthood, and is there a family history that's of relevance? So that is still a very relevant thing to do. But the difference that they were using it, the difference in application at that time was they were actually looking for it. And if you look for it, you'll find it. I think there's very few people in the population then and now who could give a full family history, and no one in anyone's extended family has ever experienced any form of mental illness, even if it's relatively mild depression and anxiety. You certainly find it in my family. My maternal grandfather was invalided out of the London Scottish after a shell attack at Vimy Ridge, and he was discharged from the army from a psychiatric hospital. That's my family history, so I've got some predisposition there. If you look for it, you'll find it. And that's certainly what they were doing. They were looking for it.
How do you think the RAF's treatment of psychiatric casualties differed from, say, the other services, Army or Navy? And how did other nationalities and other forces, I'm thinking particularly about the Royal Canadian Air Force maybe, but also particularly the United States Army Air Force. How did they deal with the issue?
Really interesting comparisons with the US AAF. And Dan mentioned Simmons and how he wasn't a particularly likeable chap. And I must admit, my opinion of Simmons waxes and wanes because he had some nasty experiences himself from Passchendaele in the First World War. But he was particularly snarky about anything the Americans did. I don't know if you've seen some of what he wrote. And I've got some of it when he and Howard Whittingham, who was the head of medical services for the RAF, and they're discussing an American report in 1945, and they're basically saying, well, that would happen, wouldn't they? They had a much higher incidence rate because they were so sympathetic, and they publicised it, and the Americans kind of told their crews that this thing was something that could happen, and it was socially acceptable if it did. So they had higher incidence rates than were reported in the RAF. Completely ignoring or deliberately ignoring the fact that reported incidents and actual incidents isn't the same thing. And thinking about air gunners as well, particularly snarky about air gunners. One of the things that came out of the American report was they found that air gunners had a higher incidence rate. And actually that was the experience in the RAF too. And I'm trying to find, it's a letter from Whittingham. I'm just going to quote because all I can do is read it, is incidentally, our experience is that air gunners are show the least favourable attitude towards the second tour of all aircrew categories, i.e. going back when you've, by some miracle, survived the first tour. This we attribute to recruitment of inferior material in the past for this type of duty.
Dear God.
It's just, you can shaking our heads.
It's a class thing again, isn't it?
Absolutely.
There's a great book by Mark K. Wells that sort of compares the two forces, and basically, obviously, that's the one.
I'm holding up Courage and Air Warfare by Mark K. Wells.
On my shelves as well. That's a cracking book. Yeah.
Yeah. So he basically says that the Americans had a far greater population to choose from, and their approach was to try and choose the best, whereas the RAF, smaller population to choose from, their approach was to eliminate the worst. Wells pretty much sort of comes to the conclusion that the incidents across both air forces was pretty much the same, whichever method they used, because you can't actually, you've got no way of knowing who can handle it and who can't.
Yeah, so you're actually in the middle of it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And one of the things that the US AAF had in place for crews serving in the UK was something called flak houses. And those who watched Masters of the Air recently will have seen there was one episode that was dedicated to, I can't remember which of the name of the crew member involved who went to a flak house.
It was Rosenthal,
country houses.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. These were country houses that were taken over by the American Red Cross for the duration. And it was about taking people outside of the environment of an operational station, giving them a break, giving them a rest, taking them away from that. And that was something different, maybe because these were Americans who couldn't just pop home for a weekend, be given some leave to visit their families as British RAF crews could. But it was a different approach and a much more sympathetic approach, and a recognition that this was a phenomena that needed understanding. And
I don't know if it was really a different approach. It's just it was just set up better because it had to be. So in the RAF, if you had a decent medical officer who noticed that a crew was getting a bit stressed, they could say, right, you're having some leave, and in the case of if they're a British crew, you can go home. But even with Canadians and Australians and New Zealanders, because the way the Dominions were fairly new, the chances are that there'll be a distant relative or family member that they could go and stay with, and if not, they would stay with the crew. So they still got a break. It just wasn't quite as well organised as the Americans. The other thing that I've come across in a couple of memoirs and a couple of books that are behind me on the shelves is the medical officer would take somebody into the sick quarters on the station and give them 48 hours bed rest. And this usually meant knocking them out with various drugs for a little while. Because that was part of the idea that you get better by having physical or temporal distance away from
By being unconscious for a little while.
Yeah. So I've forgotten who that was. It happened to Don Charlwood. Don Charlwood, I think. Yeah, 103 Squadron, Elsham Wells. He's got a couple of books. No Moon Tonight. I think in one of those he mentions that him and some members of his crew had a very strange couple of days in the sick quarters on the station.
Yeah. So in my talk at We Have Ways Fest a few weeks ago, and I'm talking about forward psychiatry in the desert, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things I talk about is the use of anaesthesia and the fact that they were knocking people out for a couple of days. That was a regular treatment in forward psychiatric units.
There's the thinking behind that as well as giving them physical rest, you are giving their brains a rest as well, if you like.
Yeah.
By today's standards, anyway, it just seems like completely off the wall, doesn't it?
Sleep, don't underestimate the importance of sleep and rest. Again, talking about how we would undertake mental health assessments, talking about people's sleep pattern, we call it sleep hygiene. Are you getting the right sleep? And focus on regaining a sleep pattern and people not being able to sleep. It is really important in mental health. Whether they were doing that from an informed basis or whether they were just thinking, we'll just knock them out for a couple of hours and see what happens, probably the latter. But sleep is very important for mental health.
And Jane, station level, the good medical officers were doing everything they possibly could to help the crews. When they were flying nights, they would have light treatment rooms, and you'd bring a crew in to give them a hit of ultraviolet light. So, is it vitamin D that gets boosted with that, amongst other things? But the good medical officers talk about using that sort of opportunity to observe the air crew and see how they are behaving. Stafford Clark talks about the importance of observing people in the mess. The problem with him was, as an officer, he could only observe the officers in the officers' mess and what's happening with the sergeant air crew.
And one of the things that Stafford Clark did, which he wasn't alone, others did as well, was if he saw crews were having a bit of a wobble or had a sticky operation, he would go with them. I think he did 15 operational flights with various crews, and that's something that medical officers did to kind of calm people down and show them it was going to be okay. It's an incredibly brave thing to do.
That really is outstanding, isn't it? Yeah, above and beyond, that's fantastic. We're going to move on to the issue of LMF, lack of moral fibre now. Dan, you wrote a fantastic article in an academic journal about lack of moral fibre. And you said that the history of LMF, as we'll call it, is complicated by how changing medical theories are understood and by the assessments of the numbers involved using imprecise definitions. And you've argued that LMF is shrouded in myths and influenced by changing medical beliefs, the limitations of archival sources, and also by veterans' own hopes for recognition. There's a huge amount to pick over just there. Can you begin by explaining to listeners who may not be familiar with the concept what the lack of moral fibre policy was and how it came about?
Right. So the first thing is this came about from a meeting in March 1940, and it seems to be just a phrase that was plucked out of the air. Anyone who, as I say, volunteered to fly, chooses not to fly anymore, would be hit with this handle, lack of moral fibre. So there's a couple of really important things. It is not a medical diagnosis.
Yeah.
Although during the war, lots of people thought it was. Not the medical profession. They were always fighting against this and saying, you can't involve us in this. It's nothing to do with medicine. But throughout the war, people thought it was a medical diagnosis. It was contagious. If one crew got it, someone else would sort of magically catch it. So it's not medical diagnosis. It's still thought of as a medical diagnosis. People now, as I mentioned in my paper, and you've just mentioned it, the changing medical theories. When the DSM came out, late 70s, early 80s, with this concept of PTSD, then you start getting people and historians applying that retrospectively. And they're going, all these crew were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. It's really bad historical practice to take a modern diagnosis and apply it retrospectively.
I'm nodding furiously because that's one of my soapboxes.
Thank you.
Whenever I talk on this, and I'm sure you've heard as well when I've had questions from audiences, people talk about PTSD, they had PTSD. And I'm like,
Wesley's got an interesting paper looking at all these sorts of illnesses, diagnoses over time, and they all have similarities, but they basically argue that person's reaction to the stresses of combat is culturally constructed to some extent. So you get different symptoms in the First World War, which is seen as shell shock, to those that you get in the Vietnam War, which is where PTSD was sort of described from. Well, if I remember correctly, it's a sort of mixture of Vietnam and the studies of survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
It was originally post-Vietnam syndrome, but that was what was informing then DSM-3 when it was published.
And every single generation kind of thinks that medicine is, they've found the answers, and what people think at any particular time is the cutting edge, and we've got no idea what's going to come along down the track later on. So 30, 40 years time, people might be laughing at PTSD. I don't know.
And it is a specific diagnosis.
So I think that whole thing to clarify then is that lack of moral fibre is an administrative classification or policy or description. It is not a medical diagnosis, even though at the time many of the crews who were flying thought that it was, and that they were worried about, in quotation marks, being diagnosed as having LMF. And that's just absolutely not the case. But that's perhaps how it operated in the minds of the aircrew and how they viewed it. Would you say that that's fair?
Yeah, it is. I mean, so what happens, there was this meeting, and then a letter was sent round to all stations, all squadrons, setting out this procedure and what would happen if somebody was deemed to be lacking moral fibre, or if for a medical reason they couldn't fly anymore. And the problem is, whether it's a genuine medical diagnosis, or if it's this executive decision made by the CEO or somebody that this person is lacking in moral fibre, two things happened, one quickly and one over a period of time. Very, very quickly, the airman in question would be kicked off the station. So he would disappear. No one would ever see him ever again. The second thing that would happen, whether he was medically downgraded or whether he went down the LMF route, is he would lose his wings. He would lose his brevet. So if people saw an airman with a dark patch on his tunic where his brevet and his wings used to be, his badges of rank used to be, they would naturally assume he was lacking in moral fibre, and he might actually be suffering from anxiety or hysteria or depression or any of the other things that they were diagnosed with. The rumour that always goes round is that the airman in question was paraded in front of the rest of the squadron. His wings and his rank badges were ripped off his arm, and he was marched off in total disgrace. I'm sure that did happen on a couple of stations, a couple of squadrons, but it wasn't what was supposed to happen. What was supposed to happen was they were meant to be sent out packing quickly to a not yet diagnosed neuropsychiatric centre, where they would undergo lots and lots of tests to see whether they had a medical reason for their inability to fly. And as I said earlier, medical officers were finding predisposition in about 50% of people. The psychiatrists, psychologists, neurologists at the NYDN centres were finding it in about 72%. But as far as the aircrew who are continuing to fly operations go, it doesn't really matter whether someone's a medical case or an LMF case. What matters is they have disappeared, and you can think up whatever you like about what's happened to them. And this idea, this concept, became a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. It worked because the rumours went round of, this has happened to somebody, it could happen to you, it could happen to me.
Yeah, I think
that's the kind of way it worked.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, really. Do you think the impact of the LMF policy has been exaggerated, both sort of at the time and subsequently by historians? Or do you think that the fear of being declared lack of moral fibre was a real threat as far as air crews were concerned, because it was equated by them with cowardice, wasn't it? Or many of them.
Yeah, I mean, there were crew who would rather be killed than to be branded LMF. It's really hard to know the numbers. I think it's far fewer than people originally believed, because, as I say, everybody who disappeared that might have been a bit shaky, they sort of naturally assumed they were LMF, whereas they might have had a medical diagnosis. Whittingham in April 45 said something along the lines that every year across the whole RAF there were about 3,000 cases of nervous breakdown, and 300 of those would eventually be found to be lacking in moral fibre. 1/3 of those would be in bomber command, the other third were in training command. So actually there's a hell of a lot of cases of instances of either medical or refusing to fly that happened before they ever went operational. It doesn't fit with this narrative of somebody couldn't take it to think of that happening when they were still training, but that's what happened. The Lawson Memorandum, which is held by the Air Historical Branch, where it's a copy of it, Lawson says it's something like 4,000 cases of LMF were submitted, and just over 2,500 cases were actually classified as lack of moral fibre. And again, he breaks it down as to officers and NCOs. Unfortunately, that's not dated, so we don't know if that's his record across the whole year or whatever. But it's a very, very small minority of people that were actually found to be LMF. But the fear of it's a draconian measure that actually worked. I think Edgar Jones calls it the stick to beat aircrew with, and it was effective. It was an effective deterrent. It stopped people from stopping flying.
It was like the equivalent of the cane on top of the headmaster's body, that kind of thing. It was like you say, it was the fear of it rather than the actual use of it or knowing someone who'd been subject to it. And we've mentioned individuals, station medical officers previously, Stafford Clark as an example. And one of the things I found is that the care for the individual and the care for the well-being of the individual was largely evidenced in the memoirs, the records of those individual station medical officers. When you're looking at the strategy and policy level and the formulation of the LMF policy, there's no concern for the welfare of the individual, or at least very little. But that doesn't mean it wasn't there. I kind of use the term, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, because there definitely was concern for the individual, but it was very subjective, and it was the individual station medical officers doing that in how they interpreted policy, practiced themselves. And Dan mentioned R.D. Gillespie as a psychiatrist, and I'm just looking at his book in front of me, The Psychological Effects of War on Citizen and Soldier, which he published in 1944. And one of the things he says is the pattern of war neuroses is greatly influenced by doctors. And I think that sums it all up, is the individual practitioners, their understanding, their knowledge of the men, largely we're describing men involved. But I would go back to the class issue that Dan mentioned before. It was really important. Many of the station medical officers made an effort to know the men as individuals, but that involved seeing them in their downtime in the mess. And that only works if you're looking at officers. Yes. So there was something about how the other ranks were understood and treated.
I was just chuckling for a second there, because we've got the same books on the bookshelves behind us.
We have.
Yeah.
We're like bookshelf twins, Dan, aren't we?
It's the other thing that's really interesting is that there isn't a lot of consistency. I mean, we've all worked with operational record books, and we all know that some squadrons are better than others at the record keeping, and they're easy to read and more detail. It's exactly the same with the interpretation of this waiverer's letter that went round. There were 3 different versions, because the medical services kept kicking back and fighting against this draconian policy and saying it's not a medical thing, it shouldn't really have anything to do with us. But the interpretation of this set of rules really depended on the individual CEO and indeed the medical officer, and some were kinder or more sympathetic or more in tune with their aircrew than others. So there's no one size fits all. It happens differently on different stations and different squadrons at different times throughout the war.
I've seen examples as well of the medical officer getting the station chaplain involved as well to basically just go and have a chat with the air crew, and whether they, I don't know, found it easier to talk to chaplains or whatever. I don't know. But yeah, as you say, it really differed hugely from station to station. Where do you think this whole sort of attitude towards mental health comes from at this particular time? Does it derive from the Victorian British sense of, always keeping a stiff upper lip or that sort of thing? Is it peculiarly British, do you think, or is it sort of more widespread at time? That's a massive question, isn't it?
See, this is when I get my other hat on and I go to the other end of the bookshelves and start talking about my practice history and history of mental health and mental illness and mental health legislation. And we could spend hours.
Yeah, it's a minefield.
I have a wince because it's mental health and mental illness.
It's, I think at this time in the early 40s, it's got its roots in the sort of eugenicist movement. So it has this kind of parallels to where the Nazis were coming from. And some people are better, superior than others. And that's half the issues with it. I mean, going back to David Stafford Clark and his sort of contempt for some of the non-commissioned air crew, him and Lawson in their correspondence are talking to each other about flight engineers and wireless operators and air gunners, and they're sort of suggesting that these people only volunteered to become air crew for the glamour and the promotion rather than why an officer would, for king and country and those sorts of things. So, the wrong attitude. But it's again, it goes back to this idea of class and who they thought people were. Stafford Clark, he was a medical officer in France up to the fall of France. I think he was evacuated. He was then briefly posted to Balloon Command, and he hated it because in his words, he'd gone from living and working with heroes to looking after people's corn plasters as they were, struggling to raise balloon barrages, and they were old tired men and women, and not the fighting men that he wanted to associate with. And he was very, very happy when he got posted back to Bomber Command. But that attitude, his stuff that he's left behind is fantastic. It's one of the best sources we have for looking at the role of the medical officer and lack of moral fibre. But he was very much of his time, shall we say.
And I think it is about thinking about what are we talking about when we're describing mental health issues, and people who've had some kind of mental breakdown. And I'm using euphemisms myself. I'm very mindful of that because I'm struggling with which terms to use. There's so much written about, well, what word are we going to use that says what we want it to say, means what we need it to mean, doesn't get misinterpreted, has enough stigma so we're not saying it's okay, but equally, it's an absolute minefield in terms of the language. But thinking about, we're not talking about mental illness as we might understand it today. We're talking about people who are being asked to do the unthinkable. Go into a situation that, how on earth are we expecting them to do it once, let alone twice? Really, you want me to get on that aircraft again and fly over into occupied territory and drop bombs on them? And, really?
I mean, imagine what it must have been like.
We expecting.
Yeah, if you have a bad first operation, if it goes really badly and it's really rough, knowing that you then have to do that another 29 times, typically, possibly even more. How do you even begin to sort of process that and cope with it? It's unimaginable. But to my mind anyway, I just can't even begin to think how that must have felt.
There'd be an argument to say it's completely rational to say, I'm not doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So there was a memo sent round to the medical officers fairly early on in the war. I've forgotten the name of it now, but it tells the medical officers what to look out for. And it's the typical kind of stress symptoms of drinking more, smoking more, visibly shaking, disassociating yourself from other people. Just the stress of flying operations is we just can't fathom it. There's a diary belonging to a chap that's in the IBCC Digital Archive, and it's fairly horrific because you read it and then suddenly it just stops because he doesn't come back, folks. Spoilers. But at the start, when he's talking about his training, he's filling in pages and pages of what he's doing and where he's going and who he's going out with and what films he's seeing. And he writes pages and pages and pages. And this carries on throughout all his training. When he's posted to an operational station, he just starts writing less and less and less until he's just recording, the date, the target, the bomb load, and that's it. So it's just, you can see this down.
My grandmother used to say that about my great uncle when he first began his operational tour, and obviously he was coming home quite regularly, about every 6 weeks or so, as they did. He would be full of chat and telling her all about what had gone off, But after about, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 operations, he began to talk less and less and less about it every time he came home. And then it got to the point where he just wouldn't discuss it at all. And that continued after the war. He just didn't talk about it. So you can see that almost gradual withdrawal, if you like, which, it's just awful to see.
David Stafford Clark, in one of his papers, identified 4 groups of where and when and how people might start to struggle. And he saw them as temporary failures or permanent failures. So in your temporary failures group, you've got people who start to waver after doing about 8 operations, between 8 and 12 operations. And then, but if you talk with the right treatment, talking to them, giving them some rest, maybe knocking them out in the sick quarters for a bit, they could continue to fly. And then you get the early fatigue type chaps who, after about 24, would start to, be seen to be wearing thin. And good medical officers could take a crew off operations before they'd done the 30. Stafford Clark and lots of the psychiatrists at NYDN centres were saying, why don't more people do this?
I think that's what happened to my uncle's crew. They did 25. Yeah.
Yeah. The decent CO, decent medical officer, probably. And then your permanent failures is the people who just can't do it after 1 or 2 operations. Theoretically, they've not experienced a great amount of flying stress. They've not had any shaky doos or great amounts of trauma, but they just go, no, this is not for me, can't do it.
Some people just don't like flying. Of course.
Yeah. But they would be seen as permanent failures. If you can't hack it after 1 or 2 ops, you're probably not going to be able to be persuaded to do any more. So then it's you either decide whether they're a medical case or lack of moral fibre. And that, again, boils down to their case histories and whether they're deemed to be predisposed to this. And then the other ones, it could happen at any time during a tour, who just had a really, really traumatic experience. But at the time, the traumatic experience didn't matter. It was the calibre, the quality of the person that was the thing that was to blame. But again, if somebody went through what that chap went through in Masters of the Air, that doesn't matter to us. We go, well, hang on a minute, sod this for a game of soldiers. I'm not playing. I want my ball back. I'm going home. But no, that's just stiff upper lip, old boy. You're meant to just suck it up and get on with that. It's you that's at fault if you can't do it. There's a psychiatrist at Rawsby NYDN Centre who also had 4 different groups, but it all boils down to how predisposed someone could be seen to be.
And again, that all relates back to that class thing as well, doesn't it, that we've been talking about? Yeah. Thanks, Dan and Mary. That was absolutely fabulous. A really, really great discussion, which I think we could have gone into lots of rabbit holes down there, that's for sure. What I'll do is I'll post links to relevant articles and publications in the show notes. So if either of you think of any particular ones that might be relevant, just let me know and I'll add them into the show notes so people can read up on this topic afterwards if they want to find out more. Now, coming up in future episodes, we're going to be talking about the US Army Air Force contribution and, of course, Masters of the Air, which we've just touched upon briefly this evening. And we also have a special Operation Market Garden episode when we're going to be discussing the role of bombers as glider tugs. Nobody ever talks about that. So really looking forward to that one. And about the Glider Pilot Regiment. As always, do give us a follow on social media. We're on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, Instagram and YouTube. And please continue to send in your questions. We'll be doing another question and answer episode again shortly. Don't forget to leave us a review or star rating wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to help us to produce more great content even, please hit that subscribe button in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks again to Dan and Mary. See you next time. Bye.